Hello everybody, just another ranking video. And not even a very original one, since I have made a similar video a while ago featuring the ranking of all Towntown volumes. But that was in German, and also it was embedded in a larger video. So I this gave me certainly a chance or opportunity to revisit this ranking list of mine and see if my ranking of these comics have changed in the last, I think, 2 years. But I must say, with the exception of one or two minor changes, I still stand behind my list that I've printed out here. So let's get on with it, since Hergé and Tintin certainly don't need an introduction. At the same time, I will add a grading to each volume based on a very typical 5-star grading system. But I also do add a kind of additional level above that, which I call 5-star Ultra, which is kind of like the S tier if you are operating in a tier system. Anyway, let's begin. So the number 25 at the bottom of my list is the 1930s Towntown in the Congo. This is not very unique or surprising. This is the one volume that is being criticized a lot as racist, or to be much more precise in my wording, as paternalistic. But the other problem with this volume has to do with the fact that the story is basically boring and nonsensical. In all fairness, though, it's important to see that this one album started to come out in 1930, which means Hergé was 23 years old. He was still a lightweight in the editorial office of the Le 20e siècle newspaper, and his drawing hand was firmly guided by his boss, Abbé Norbert Vallès, who was not only a Catholic priest, but also a fierce fascist. Obviously, the task of this comic was to keep brainwashing the children of Belgium in regard of the giant colony of Belgish Congo. Of course, this whole volume is Hergé's big youthful folly. We are not born accomplished geniuses. There is a trajectory involved. And this is the world Hergé was born into. So don't judge him based on his background and his youthful mistakes, but based on his ability and success to outgrow these disadvantages. But on the other hand, Hergé never fully disavowed this volume. On the contrary, he already worked on a colorized version in 1946. Of course, with some massive changes, aware of the tasteless stuff from the first edition. You could write a whole book only on the changes that Hergé made to his own albums over the course of decades. Number 24. Same period of time, the 1929's Towntown in the land of the Soviets. This is the very first Towntown story that Hergé created. Again, strongly under the guiding influence of Norbert Vallès, this time attacking the Soviet Union and the communists. This is still more of a cartoon strip than a proper comic, and light years away from the richness and artistic quality that would one day follow. The volume is certainly interesting for us Tintinologists because it is here that you can see the early seedlings of all these classic Tintinesque ideas. The story, as far as you can call it a story, is very rapid and very fast-paced, which is the one plus that this volume has. This kind of energy and this in those years, this very original approach towards kind of a rapid storytelling. That is something that Hergé has certainly refined over the years and decades, this dynamic, high energy style. That is why Hergé was so influential on a certain type of filmmakers, for example. The attacks on the Soviet Union in this story are rather infantile, but on one or two occasions actually contain some kind of a smart, interesting reflection. But they are certainly a far cry from the satirical strength that Hergé would reach many years later. But in all fairness, when Hergé was drawing this strip, the word comics wasn't even invented. And particularly in Europe, it would be Hergé who would lead the charge to pioneer and actually shape this entire art form. So yeah, it's a shitty comic somehow, but let's cut the boy some slack. But interesting fact, so if you read Wikipedia, it claims that Hergé prevented the reprint of this early work until 1973, basically considering it too amateurish. But that is not true. I have the receipts to prove that. It was the other way around, since Tintin in the Land of Soviets was a bit of a collector's object in the seedy comic underground, often created from cutout pages from the original Petit Vingtième. Hergé wanted to do something against Tintin being sold on the black market, and it was Castelman who rejected this idea for years until Hergé started to threaten them that he will publish it with someone else if they don't do it. Anyway, just a little tidbit. Number 23 is the 1973's Tintin and the Lake of Sharks. So I'm almost too generous for giving this 2.5 stars, and it should not be in this list at all, simply because it has very little to do with Hergé. He did not write it, and he did not draw it. This is based on the animated movie from the 70s, and what they did is taking single frames from the movie and work them over with speech bubbles and touch it up, and that way turn the animated movie into a comic. The story isn't very good. It is not even ligne claire, actually. And the entire project has a strong feel of pastiche, since it tries rather hard to be truthful to Hergé's ideas, and basically does not dare to step out of the line for a moment, which then leads to a rather dull result. So it feels like some weird remix of all kind of ideas that we have seen in real Tintin volumes. There are moments of nostalgia and certain melancholy towards the glorious years of Tintin. Now, people often think this whole album was something that Castelman printed after Hergé's death, kind of circumventing his testament that clearly forbid any continuation of Tintin with original work. But that is not true. This actually came out in 1973, when Hergé was still alive and kicking. And he agreed to it for one and only reason. I mean, he thought, this is shit, but, you know. That's the stupid money that all artists love, because you don't need to lift a finger to get it. But overall, this is something for the completist or the Tintinologist. Number 22. Tintin in America. Tintin in America was Hergé's third album, right after the Congo story. Hergé actually wanted to make this as his second story right after In the Land of the Soviets. But Norbert Vallès insisted that he makes the story about Belgish Congo first. But after this was done, Hergé started to gain a certain assertiveness and started to learn to stand up for himself. So step by step he made it clear to Norbert Vallès, whom he respected and almost adored. I mean, Vallès basically arranged Hergé's marriage with his secretary Germain, but that is another story. Anyway, he made it clear to Wallace that from now on he would be responsible for Towntown's travel destinations and the overall topics of his stories. But that went hand in hand with two factors. One, Hergé started to become known or even well known, which in 1930 or in 1931 was somewhat unheard of for a cartoon artist. And second, he constantly rose through the ranks. So in 1931 he was basically the editor-in-chief of Le Petit Vingtième, this children insert to the newspaper. Towntown in America is surely a satirical attack on the modern American culture. The position is very anti-capitalist, which is something Hergé maintained his entire life. But while this type of critique usually would come from a hard leftist corner, in Hergé's case the critique was aligned with the Catholic and conservative ideology of Le XXe siècle. While the overall story is rather weak and the well-meant portrayal of the Native Americans is checkered, to put it mildly, there are some very strong moments in this volume. I mean, the talent slowly begins to shine. Some panels already show what made Hergé so great. This also marks Hergé's readership of the French magazine Les Crapouillots, which was this extremely provocative, controversial magazine. Les Crapouillots was very libertarian on the one hand, not shying away from difficult topics, while being often rather right-wing. But in those years it was a fascinating publication that influenced heavily Hergé's early work. Not only with Tintin, but particularly Quick and Flupke, which was this somewhat anarchic cartoon strip about two kids mostly living in the streets of Brussels. Anyway, number 21 is the 1983's Tintin and Alf Art, unfinished. So this is the other album that actually should not be on this list, but I put it there just for fun. It is the unfinished album that Hergé drew till his demise. Since his testament forbid any new material, this remained a bunch of sketches and kind of 2/3 of a script. This here is the clandestine edition created by the Canadian artist Rodier. Maybe it would have been a good story, who knows? There are strong and rather mature ideas in this last Hergé volume. It is certainly not a comic set up for kids, at least that's how I perceive it, but we'll never know. I have a hard time to believe that Hergé would have left the narrative the way it is now. It is just not strong enough and has some rather boring length, actually. But Hergé was known to rework his scripts quite heavily, so who knows. But the story certainly reflects a very particular chapter in Hergé's life. Hergé became fascinated with modern art in the 60s and quickly turned into a collector of paintings, always troubled by the fact that as a cartoonist, even as the most successful cartoonist in Europe, he could not afford to purchase the same amount of art as some of his rather rich friends and probably enemies. But he, for example, co-financed an art gallery for a friend of his and basically lived there for years. But in the 70s, his mood and notions about modern art started to shift because he became more and more aware and appalled of the snobbery and the randomness of it all. So a central part of Tintin and Alf Art is a frontal attack on the modern art scene. And quite a mockery, making fans of modern artists look like idiots, willing to overprice every piece of garbage that is suddenly en vogue. But still, as far as social satire goes, Hergé made much stronger volumes, I feel. Number 20, 1932's Cigars of the Pharaoh. So, Cigars of the Pharaoh is another volume from the early years. This came out as his fourth Towntown story right after Towntown in America. And I think while it is not the greatest narrative, not the greatest story, it is rather absurd in some parts. It certainly makes an important step to a particular direction. Hergé did not want Tintin to be only a vehicle for conservative social and political criticism. Tintin should most of all be a canvas for escapism. This is 1932, and those are not particularly easy years for children growing up in the streets of Brussels and Antwerp. So Hergé certainly saw his function in creating a window into an adventurous, exotic world where kids could just find seclusion and refuge. And the escapistic dimension of Tintin would later certainly become the primal raison d'être of those volumes. Now, like many of Hergé's early work, this has been completely redrawn in 1955. And again, while the atmosphere of this adventure is quite fine, the story is not particularly great. But it also marks something very new in Tintin's chronology. It is the first volume that ends on a cliffhanger, so put together with the follow-up, you got a nice long double feature adventure story. Now in this particular case, this volume here, the Cigars of the Pharaoh, and the consecutive volume, the Blue Lotus, are incredibly far apart in quality. I mean, a lot of people think the Blue Lotus is one of the greatest comics ever created. So I get back to that one later, but very much later. Let's continue with the number 19. And number 19, in my humble opinion, is the 1950s Land of the Black Gold, Au Pays de l'Or Noir. So this is a decent comic that was released in Hergé's prime years, but it's also a bit of a letdown compared with the gems and masterpieces that surrounded this comic in those very particular years. But there is a unique story to this one. Hergé started to write and draw this one before World War II. He was interested in the rise of the Saudi family in Arabia and the creation of the Arabic states, particularly in the context of oil. And this story actually appeared in Le Petit Vingtième for a while, for maybe 30% of the overall story. Then the war broke out and Belgium was occupied by the Germans, who shut Le XXe siècle down. And while Hergé soon continued working under the occupation, he wisely left Land of Black Gold in the drawer, mostly because it had Dr. Müller, who was this German villain and basically a guy financing terrorists in the Middle East. So that was certainly off the table while the Nazis controlled Belgium. And I could ramble just 2 hours straight just on Hergé's years during the occupation, which is all very fascinating, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. Anyway, after the war, Raymond Leblanc starts the Tintin magazine, and Hergé works his ass off with very demanding stories, and he became completely exhausted to the point of multiple nervous breakdowns and meltdowns he had in those years. And most of them are pretty well documented. So instead of picking up Destination Moon, which was already in discussion as the next Tintin story, he remembered this aborted project about the Saudi Arabia and saw an opportunity to get a whole volume done, but with investing much less energy into the project. And it worked. It is a decent story, not too great. Hergé had to apply some trickery here, particularly because the original 1939 strip was written before Hergé invented Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus. So now, in 1948, Hergé had to squeeze Haddock and Calculus somehow into the story. Again, it is not a very strong comic and a bit of an interesting Frankenstein's monster as far as the flow of the story is concerned, but it has a nice exotic vibe and in parts a rather weird humor, And it is drawn very well, so some people don't like this volume at all, but I think it is fine. But it is probably the last volume here in this ranking where my short analysis is heavier on the critical side, because from now on, basically each volume is pretty great with an incredible steep curve of growing quality. Imagine that we are only at rank 19 out of 25. So let's continue. On ranking position number 18, The Broken Ear, L'Oreille Cassée. So this is one of Hergé's best albums from the very early years, I think. This was his sixth Towntown story, while the majestic and completely mind-blowing The Blue Lotus was the fifth. So creating this story was a bit of a challenge for Hergé. But it's important to understand that his major rule number one in creating Tintin was always that every new volume needed to be completely different in mood, nature and substance to the previous one. So he never wanted to repeat himself with Tintin. So Hergé certainly didn't try to make Blue Lotus the sequel, but went in a completely different direction. Less stylish probably, more gritty actually, but in a very exciting way. This whole project started once again with an article that Hergé read in Le Crapouillot about the Chaco War between Paraguay and Bolivia in the early 30s, which was something not very well documented by the journalists in those days, while at the same time there were all kind of arms merchants and oil industrialists involved, since it was a territorial war largely ignited by the assumption that there was oil under the Chaco. Anyway, this became a story about a stolen artifact. Tintin follows the thieves to South America, where he unexpectedly finds himself between the front lines of a regional conflict and becomes entangled in a regime change created by General Alcazar, who becomes this recurring character in the Towntown universe. I really like the subversive tone that emerges in this story. And the whole story is a bitter charge against armed dealers, whom I still consider one of the lowest creatures in existence. I find cockroaches much higher on the evolutionary ladder than weapons merchants. And I feel Hergé felt the same. But this story is also a stern attack on the American oil industry. Overall, this is an interesting combination of a crime story where Tintin investigates a museum theft on the trail of the thieves, while it is this adventurous commentary on the meddling of foreign powers in so-called banana republics. So in many sense, I feel like this one has actually aged pretty well, considering how old it is. Number 17 brings us to 1968 and the volume Flight 714 to Sydney. Vol 714 pour Sydney. So this is one of the last volumes Hergé created, and while the two albums he did prior to that had a bit of a pensive, almost introverted nature, he felt that he must do something for the readers who like Tintin being sucked into some really meaty adventure. So he decided that the next Tintin story will be a crossover of two genres that, as we know now, go very well together, being science fiction and being action. Flight 714 to Sydney is foremost an energetic action story that has basically everything. Hijacked airplane, terrorists, equatorial islands in the Indonesian Sea, epic shootouts and all kind of mayhem is happening there. But this story is also highly influenced by the then rather popular Paleoceti hypothesis. And no, I refuse to call it a theory. It has no theoretical properties. It is still good fun though. I always liked the ancient astronauts. But in those days, Erich von Däniken hadn't published his first book, when Hergé did this comic. So he was mostly influenced by Pauwels and Bergier and their highly poetic and somewhat mind-blowing book called Le Matin des Magiciens, The Dawn of Magicians. This is certainly one of those divisive Tintin comics. Some people love it a lot, while others rather dismiss it. This volume certainly looks great and has some of the most iconic scenes. This is also the time when Hergé worked with Roger Leloup, who was this incredible comic artist, very well known for his depiction of airplanes and all kind of flying vehicles. That gives this story an additional edge. Number 16 is the 1942's The Shooting Star, L'Étoile Mystérieuse. Now this might actually be the first Tintin comic I've ever seen or read, if I remember this correctly. This one is known for its underlying dark themes. It begins with a rather apocalyptic atmosphere. An asteroid is falling on Earth, and of course Tintin and Snowy are in the middle of it. Hergé made this comic in 1941, so deep into the German occupation of Belgium, which is often being cited as the reason for the grim undertones. But at the same time, it is a little excursion in the world of the fantastic while being an escapistic adventure in the northern Atlantic. It is the second volume with Captain Haddock, whom we still can experience as an active seaman and professional shipping captain. Overall, this is a great romp with a lot of iconic panels. This was also the first volume that did not first appear in black and white to be later colorized, but came out in color right away. I call those years Hergé's yellow period, not because of his checkered relationship with the occupants, but because he uses a lot of bright yellow in this comic. Number 15 is the 1958's The Red Sea Sharks, Coq en stock. So this one actually rather divides the fans, because some find it simply incredible and one of Tintin's most dynamic and exciting adventures, while others are a little more skeptical, claiming that this is actually the first Tintin book that does not bring anything new to the table. It seems to assemble a story out of story elements that had worked before, so in the end it is a little bit of everything, like a greatest hits album. Yeah, I get it, what people mean, but at the same time it is a wonderful escapistic adventure. It was a dangerous play by Hergé because once again, after almost 30 years, Africans appear in his story, and I'm sure Casterman was worried how this would turn out. I mean, Hergé was not Hugo Pratt. Hergé's approach was in the style of caricatures and newspaper cartoons, hence there was always the danger that something will be perceived as racist. But this time things were at least a little different, although there had been immediate attacks and Hergé was quite upset by them. Certainly his choice of using pidgin for the Africans to speak was something that caused headache to Casterman, and so Hergé had to change a lot of it. This is also a unique situation that reflects a time in Hergé's life where he was certainly more relaxed and things seemed under control, to the extent that Hergé and Bob Demore took a passage on a cargo ship as a research project to be able to be more authentic and precise while showing the parts of the story that take place on the cargo ship Ramona. So this was a rather unusual tactic for Hergé, and him and Bob Demore had actually a great time traveling with this industrial freighter for a week or two, making a lot of photographs and both sketching a ton of images. And it yielded some great results. Overall, this is a great, highly adventurous story bringing Tintin, Snowy and Haddock back into the Middle East. I'm a big fan of this story, actually. Number 14 is the 1947's The Seven Crystal Balls, Les Sept Boules de Cristal. So, as I said, there was a bit of a mantra that every new volume of Tintin must not be a repetition, but has to carry something entirely new. The 1947's The Seven Crystal Balls turns to the genre of horror and mystery thrillers. Returned members of an archaeological expedition fall one after the other into coma, so Towntown and Haddock of course investigate. But this story quickly turns out to be much more, ending on a sharp cliffhanger. This is the third time that Tintin has a longer story made of 2 consecutive volumes, and this approach was rather taxing for Hergé. These years represent the chapter in his life when he was the most exhausted and repeatedly on the verge of nervous breakdowns. Well, occasionally more than just the verge. Also, this volume has a difficult genesis because when Hergé started to draw this volume, Belgium was still occupied by the Germans. That was in 1943. And in 1944, in September, the Germans were pushed back since meanwhile D-Day had happened, and Hergé was immediately blacklisted as a Third Reich collaborator and branded an uncivique, basically a non-citizen. His permit to work was taken away from him. His driver's license was revoked, and he was basically done. More than enough people just wanted to spit at him. But a year later, in the fall of 1946, the war was over by now, and he was visited by 3 men who were all 3 former resistance fighters, so basically people who once pledged to kill people like Hergé. Anyway, these 3 guys, Raymond Leblanc, André Sinave and Albert Debatty, had a proposal. They wanted to start a comic anthology magazine with Tintin at the center, the famous Tintin magazine. Hergé, of course, said, "I can't do that, I'm blacklisted." Raymond Leblanc answered, "That is our problem. We need you to draw." Now, they did not want Hergé just for his artistic talent. There was also the fact that before the war, he had spent at least 9 years basically running the Petit Vingtième booklets, so he knew everything about this business. But the whole thing took forever to make it work, at least another 18 months. There are people in the new administrative apparatus of Belgium that were so dead set against the idea that Hergé publishes another drawing ever again. So that alone is quite a dramatic story, how that all was made and achieved. There were some big former resistant fighters locking horns over Hergé, and Hergé was not a good team player, which was always the problem. So a lot of respect to Raymond Leblanc, who kept his nerves. Interestingly, the story was continued, but not fully republished in the brand new magazine. That started already with the magazine started already with the conclusion called Prisoners of the Sun. But Casterman more or less simultaneously released this volume as a complete book. The other interesting thing here is that it marks the beginning of the collaboration between Hergé and Edgar Pierre Jacobs of Blake and Mortimer's fame, of course, who is one of the greatest Franco-Belgic comic artists of this era and the other big name of the Ligne Claire. So, number 13, 1940s, The Crab with the Golden Claws. Les Crabes aux Pinces d'Or. This is of course a unique album for a whole range of reasons. But most of all, this is the story where Tintin meets Captain Haddock on board of the murky freighter Caraboujan for the first time. A large part of the story takes place in North Africa and in the Sahara, but this is also the first story that Hergé created for Les Soirs during the German occupation. If we were to divide Hergé's body of work into parts or phases, this would be the beginning of the high point period, the artistic heyday. That being said, the story is not perfect and certainly drags its feet towards the end. On the other hand, it is a very important volume, marking a new tone in Tintin stories. Political messages completely disappear. Social commentary certainly takes a backseat for many years, and the vacuum is being filled with timeless escapistic adventure. The display of Haddock's alcoholism is actually rather brutal in this first volume, with the choleric captain. Hergé toned it down a bit in the following years. Number 12 is the 1943's The Secret of the Unicorn, Le Secret de la Licorne. So this volume is certainly a very essential Tintin story, created in 1943 in the heart of darkness of the German occupation, with the Second World War shaking up the human civilization. While Hergé's previous effort, The Shooting Star, might have been influenced by the grim situation of the war, particularly because Hergé's older brother Paul Remy had spent the entire war in a German prisoner of war camp. In 1943, Hergé more or less decided to detach himself completely from the entire situation. So that's why here in this time period, his most adventurous and most escapistic volumes can be found. There is no politics, no satire. It is all beautifully created to make you forget what is going on outside. And this escapistic effect still works until today, and I believe still a lot of people read particularly those volumes from the war years as means to maybe switch off their daily life or whatever. The Secret of the Unicorn is a very fast-paced story about a mysterious model ship and a treasure hunt that follows. It is a very Brussels-oriented story, while the second volume of this double feature is dedicated to exotica and adventure abroad. And that is sometimes a structure that Hergé repeated with these two-parters, where the first book is much more home-based or centered around a particular place, but building up a lot of suspense, while the second volume then breaks free and takes you to some distant part of the world for the resolution. Now this one is being revered as one of the best. I would not go that far, but it is a great achievement and a very iconic Tintin story. Number 11 is the 1937's The Black Island, L'Île Noire. So in hindsight, it is kind of weird that I put The Black Island over The Secret of the Unicorn. What am I thinking? Well, in this case, it's a bit of a style over substance situation. I think Hergé's original 1937 volume, The Black Island, is a great comic for its time. But what certainly enamored me to this volume is the 1966 rework of the entire volume, basically completely done by the mighty Bob Demore. So of all the Tintin volumes, this one is the one that has been worked over the most. So this book basically exists in three versions. There is the original 1938 version in black and white. Then there is the 1943 colorization with minor changes in the content. But in 1966, the British wanted to print this volume and sent Hergé a snag list with some 120 points they wanted to change. Now, in those days, Hergé had this huge studio at his disposal doing pretty well, despite a rather diminishing artistic output. But he had a budget at hand and decided, before going through 120 changes, what if the whole story would be remade in the more modern Tintin style that Hergé started to apply around 1939 and 1940. And why do it himself, since he had assistants in the studio that were hungry? And Bob Demore was a phenomenon. Even up until today, there hardly ever was anyone who could emulate Hergé's style with a bigger precision. There had been pranks made with Bob Demore's drawings, and Hergé himself could not tell them apart. So Hergé basically gave Bob Demore a budget, sent him to Great Britain on a reconnaissance expedition. Bob Demore came back with hundreds of photos and even an authentic policeman's uniform. and started to create this remake of the Black Island. And he put in a lot of heart and talent because this is a beautifully crafted comic. It is about Towntown traveling to Scotland to solve a typical mystery. Now, these volumes that exist in two versions have always been a topic of discussion and bickering amongst fans and Tintinologists because there are those who absolutely swear on the original black and white version that of course exists as a facsimile print today, while others like me love to admire Bob Demore's style. But that's all just a matter of taste. Now we are at the top 10, my favorite 10 Tintin books. Although some of these volumes I have just been talking about probably deserve to be in the top 10 as well, but hey, what can you do? So number 10 is the 1938's King Ottokar's Scepter, Le Sceptre d'Ottokar. Of all the nasty things that people throw at Hergé's reputation, and some of these things are actually true, the one that is not true at all, and is basically pure bullshit, is the claim that Hergé was a sympathizer with the Germans and supported their New Order doctrine of the Third Reich. That is rubbish. So even long before the invasion started, he made King Ottokar's Scepter, which is clearly a send-up of the post-1933 Germany, and certainly the Anschluss of Austria to the German Reich. And the existence of this volume was largely the reason why Hergé and his wife Germaine, plus their cat, were on the run for over a week while the Germans were advancing on Brussels. Hergé was not entirely crazy thinking that the Germans will probably put him against the wall and shoot him over King Ottokar, because it was his publishing house Castelmont who had a very bad feeling about it and strongly advised him to run. Now that turned out to be all not the case, and Hergé quickly returned to Belgium. Ironically, the Nazis somehow did not get the parody, and the only provision the occupying administration took towards Castelmont was banning Tintin in America, basically because it had America in the title. Anyway, this volume introduces us to the fictional countries Sildavia and Borduria, which we will revisit in some later volumes as well. Now, in this one comic, Hergé shows his true ideological colors. It is very apparent that he was not a proper right-winger, but he was a fervent royalist. This was the basis of his entire ordeal after the occupation, the reason why he stayed while so many artists went into the exile when the Germans were at the doorstep. Because King Leopold of Belgium directly addressed the people and asked them to remain in the country and basically to tough it out. Of course, there is the other side of the coin, that Hergé was a giant opportunist and not shy to completely dominate the comic business in those years, taking advantage of the fact that so many graphic artists who were socialists or Jews had fled the country, or even worse, had been deported to the East. There is no reasonable denying that Hergé was profiteering from that. Now for me, this is a situation very similar to the Black Island case. If this was the original 1938 drawing, I would not rank it as high, albeit it is a good story and a solid comic. But in 1947, Hergé, together with Edgar Pierre Jacobs, gave this story a complete rework with a lot of newly drawn panels, creating this beautiful new version of the book with all kind of Easter eggs and cameos in it. It absorbs cultural traits of East Europe, the Balkans, but also Eastern Austria and even a touch of Vienna. It is a bit of a self-absorbed comic, I must say, but truly beautiful. An entertaining adventure with a strong mystery factor and a touch of a spy novel. And in 1938, this was for a very long time the last Tintin story that had any political or socially critical connotations. And before I forget, this is the one volume that introduces us to Bianca Castafiore, the opera singer from Milano. That is all based on an old running gag between Hergé and Edgar Pierre Jacobs. Now, Jacobs was a semi-professional opera singer who always tried to drag Hergé into opera performances, but Hergé hated opera with a vengeance. He considered himself a jazzman and was mostly interested in all the new music coming from America. And the somewhat obnoxious diva Castafiore reflects that attitude. Number 9. The 1949's Prisoners of the Sun, Le Temple du Soleil. Now, for many, this may be their favorite volume. It is the part 2 to the continuation of the 7 crystal balls and a hilarious adventure through South America. But I think it is important to understand that this volume, more than any other, represents what was actually on Hergé's mind when he created those Towntown stories. Because here, the topos, the central theme of the story is friendship. That was something where Hergé was actually filled with a lot of pathos, and there was no way to talk him out of it. He could get very touchy about this. You must understand that Raymond Leblanc managed to clear Hergé's name, to get his working permit back, basically making him a citizen with all the rights again. But this always carried a certain expectation that Hergé would renounce all of his friends who had been as well marked as uncivique. Now, Hergé was a dedicated Boy Scout during his childhood. This notion was so inconceivable for him to turn his back on friends for ideology. And this drove Raymond Leblanc crazy. The biggest example was Raymond de Becker, the former chief editor of Le Soir, that newspaper that Hergé worked for during the occupation. And Becker was in prison for a long time, later expelled into exile before he took his own life in the late 60s. But Hergé constantly visited him in prison and sent him money for years, which was always something that just waited to be picked up by some journalists that might have thought that they haven't knocked Hergé around enough. So it is clear to me that there is no coincidence here that in 1949 this particular story would come out where Professor Calculus is being kidnapped and Tintin and Captain Haddock do not waver for a second and chase after the kidnappers around the world. There is this dedication and fidelity towards friendship amongst men that is at the heart of this story. This is presented as something that is not negotiable, and it speaks to me especially today where whole chunks of society become quite obsessed with guilt by association, what the Germans call Kontaktschuld. So this is one of the big classic stories from the oeuvre of Hergé and Tintin. Most certainly it is the one that had probably the hardest time of development, while this comic was drawn and periodically appeared in the Towntown magazine. Hergé experienced several nervous breakdowns, some of them making him disappear without a trace for days. It also marks the falling out between Edgar Pierre Jacobs and Hergé over credit and appreciation, but thankfully that was something that these two men could resolve years later. Although after Prisoners of the Sun they never worked together again. But all the mayhem surrounding this production also contributed to a very important decision, which was the foundation of the Studios Hergé. It became clear that those volumes could not be drawn by Hergé alone anymore, and they also could not be drawn by Hergé and some of his buddies whom he then would abuse for a whole year. It became a necessity to create an entire structure around Hergé that helped him to work without complete exhaustion and psychological decline. But it also means that a lot of the following albums after 1950 are a bit of a teamwork with 3 to 4 involved artists dividing the load amongst them. Number 8 is the 1960s Tintin in Tibet, Towntown au Tibet. This is quite a legendary album and maybe the most introspective by Hergé. There is an enchanting visual quality to a story that is certainly less dynamic and fast-paced than some of the others. It is also a rather romantic call to Zhang Chongren, who worked with Hergé on the Blue Lotus and whom Hergé had not seen for over 30 years at this point. And later Hergé would start a whole campaign to find the real Zhang, which is a huge, slightly crazy story in itself, but a little bit beyond the scope of this video. Now, many revere this volume as Hergé's most mature comic and probably the only Tintin comic where the idea of love clearly materializes between the panels. But of course we are talking about an universal and spiritual idea of love in a somewhat heightened state of mind. Similar to Prisoners of the Sun, the story is about friendship, but the differences are quite striking and telling. In Prisoners of the Sun, Professor Calculus gets kidnapped, and of course his friends and comrades Tintin, Snowy and Haddock immediately set out to chase down the kidnappers and save their friend. That is straightforward. But Tintin in Tibet brings these ideas and sentiments on a different level. First of all, the notion that Tintin's old friend Chang is in danger and was most likely on board of an airplane that crashed in the Himalayas comes to Tintin in a dream, in a nightmare. So this is a very faith-based behavior. And second, Captain Haddock does not even know Chang, he never met him, and yet he still goes with Tintin, whose entire motivation comes from a dream. So obviously beyond the friendship motif, this is about faith and about determination, about loyalty and fidelity. It is not surprising that this volume strongly coincides with Hergé's slow detachment from Catholicism and his ever-growing interest in Eastern mysticism and generally a rather spiritual and more universal look at Christianity. And this may not sound so special in our time and age, but remember that Hergé was born into a ultra-Catholic environment, and he was for many years the church's champion when it comes to communicating ideas to children, which the Catholics didn't take lightly. So that is, in my opinion, a part of Hergé's biography that is rather underrated, his actual ability to outgrow this allegiance to Catholicism in later years. I mean, the other chapter that coincides with this volume is the decline of Hergé's marriage with Germaine and his not very secret relationship with Fanny Vlamingh, his later second wife. And Hergé was on the one hand very enchanted by Fanny, while at the same time being rather appalled by himself. He confessed the whole thing to Germaine, I think in 1957, and to some extent, and Hergé confirmed this to some degree, writing and drawing Tintin in Tibet was some inner process to rid himself of the shame. Particularly because in 1959 he started to visit a rather famous psychoanalyst in Switzerland and later claimed that many ideas in Tintin in Tibet came to him from those therapy sessions. Now this volume is often being described as his most meditative comic, hence rather slow and free of action. That is an exaggeration. This is still a rather hilarious album with a lot of weird and goofy stuff happening. Particularly to Captain Haddock, who is this fish out of water here, basically a maritime character in the Himalayas. I like the portrayal of Nepal and Tibet in this volume as someone who traveled in those regions myself. It is a very charming adventure, not shy with exotica, but it is true that it is not very action-driven like many of those volumes in later years. And now, number 7 is the 1976 Tintin and the Picaros. So this is the last complete Tintin adventure ever created. We are back in South America and once again entangled into regime change and civil war. This time it is about Bianca Castafiore being accused of spying. Now this is probably Hergé's most political volume, next to the Blue Lotus maybe, but it is all presented through the lens of media and media manipulation. And there is a lot of meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Almost as if Hergé had listened to The Who. But it certainly reflects Hergé's interest in those years in a very similar way like the Castafiore Emerald. Both stories are basically about media. And for me this is certainly one of, if not the most intelligent Towntown volume. In the end, Tintin actually participates in a rebellion, helping his checkered buddy General Alcazar to get back to power in San Theodoros. But Hergé is also reflected enough to make clear that it won't probably make much difference, which is an incredible admission since Tintin basically led the charge of an entire coup d'etat. Mind you, it's an interesting example where Hergé actually shows his sympathies for the kind of leftist guerrilleros of South America and Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, which is certainly a contradiction to the always perpetuated accusation that Hergé supposedly had been a right-winger all his life, which he most certainly was not. But Hergé admits in this volume that basically a monster has been replaced by someone like Alcazar, who is merely the lesser evil. So I guess there is also a certain touch of realpolitik involved, but probably more Hergé's age-related cynicism. And while my own years are piling up, I start to understand that often after you achieve seniority, you look back over your shoulder and you think, yeah, but I have seen this before. It is all just old wine in new skins. And thugs will always rule because the thuggish people are not shy to climb to the top. And it is particularly the smart people who are completely clueless about this because it doesn't reflect their life's experience. Now, not everyone likes this volume. Some people think it is too heady, too cynical. I think it is one of Hergé's finest comics. He was already around 68 years old when he made it, and at this point in his life he felt that all the battles of his life had been fought, so he didn't feel he had anything to prove to anybody. Which makes the storytelling here interesting, and this volume has a lot of moments that justify a whole debate. Number 6. We go back to 1934, to the Blue Lotus. So here in the finale of my ranking list, this is the only volume from the very early era of Tintin and Hergé. But this is by far the best comic Hergé made in the 30s. It is a masterpiece of its time, but also a monolith of the comic genre. In 1933, Tintin was already very popular in Belgium, being also printed in France, in the Coeur Vaillant magazine, which was also another Catholic publication, but also translated into Dutch and printed in the Netherlands. And Hergé was in control of the editorial work of the Petit Vingtième, and that included a lot of interaction with young readers. So over time, he was always confronted with the typical reader question, where will Tintin go next? Which country and which culture will he visit? The funny thing is that in the 30s, it was the children who asked Hergé this constantly, while in the 50s, it was the adults. Now, as you maybe remember, this is a second volume to a double feature starting with the Cigars of the Pharaoh. And Cigars of the Pharaoh ends in India, and while Tintin survived all the perils, the case is actually not fully solved and closed. So Hergé made a remark in one of the editorials of Petit Vingtième that Tintin's new destination will be China. I guess Hergé felt a little forced to send Tintin to China because few issues back he had drawn an entire travel map for Tintin, and drew the line quite carelessly through the entire East Asian continent. But he knew nothing about China, and considering how he handled foreign cultures in the previous 4 volumes, it was bound to turn into an insensitive, awful mayhem. But Hergé received a letter from a Father Gosset, a Catholic priest who was very experienced with China and had a lot of Chinese students who were at the same time Petit Vingtième readers. And he expressed a lot of concern that Hergé will turn the story into a racist rant. Hergé was rather moved by it. I mean, he had a fascination for monks and priests his entire life. So he wrote Abbé Gosset back asking, well, what can I do about it? Do you know someone who could advise me? Now, this is an important milestone moment of Tintinological history. The encounter of Hergé and Zhang Choren, who was not only a Chinese student, but an accomplished, trained painter and sculptor. And Zhang was very sophisticated and an urban guy, which was a good influence on Hergé, who was still this kind of lanky, geeky boy, rather shy around people, and certainly a bit of a late bloomer compared with others. And I'm only saying that because his wife Germaine told this more than once. Anyway, what took place was an incredible synergy of 2 artists creating one of the most beautiful comics of all times. Hergé was actually puzzled when he held the first edition in his hands because he thought, oh, we made it too beautiful for kids. What have you done? Now, unlike all the other Towntown books I have been talking about, this is the only case where, with all emphasis, I advise the uninitiated reader to go for the original facsimile reprint. The black and white edition is very superior and more luxurious to read. The colored edition is okay, but somewhat cramped. But this is a monolith. Of all the comics that Hergé made, this one is the least opaque with its political accusations. This book is basically calling out the Japanese on the atrocities and depraved crimes they committed in China. Yes, there was a diplomatic note and grievance filed by Japan over this book towards Belgium in 1934, but there was never too much emphasis there because the historical facts were so undeniable. And while the collaboration of these 2 great artists lasted only a short while during the publication of this volume, Zhang left a very important lesson with Hergé and changed his approach towards future storytelling entirely. Hergé might have not always gotten it right, but comparing before and after the Blue Lotus, he became obsessed with research and the ability to be precise with the portrayal of foreign cultures. So from now on, before starting a new story, he would immerse himself in whole stacks of books and magazine articles instead of just making shit up like he did before this beautiful volume. So now we are at the top 5 books of this ranking. The grand finale. Well, in my subjective opinion anyway. But since I'm also grading these books with this typical 5-star system, and the last 6 comics I talked about were already all 5-star comics in my book, I want to point out that in my grading, which I usually use in my German language videos, mostly videos about music albums, I use this additional grade above 5 stars, which are called 5 stars ultra. I guess it is like the S tier in the tier system. Some people like to call it the God level, but I don't want to bring God into this. Anyway, the remaining 5 albums have all the 5-star ultra grading in my book. So let's begin. Number 5, the 1963 The Castafiore Emerald, Les Bijoux de la Castafiore, Now, this is a controversial choice because I know there are people who don't like this book at all. It is a very unique story in the Towntown universe, mostly because it is the one story without any traveling. There had been Tintin adventures that take place only in Brussels, but this story here takes entirely place in the Marlinspike castle where Haddock and Tintin and Professor Calculus live. By the way, a little detour. the French Cœur Vaillant magazine had printed Tintin for decades, and that was a purely Catholic publication. And they actually once invited Hergé into their offices in Paris, I think while he was on vacation there with Germaine, to talk to him. And they basically called him onto the carpet, to question him. Just what the hell is going on? Why does Tintin still have no family and children, as every young, mature young man should have? And why does he instead live with this older, bearded man in this decadent household without any women? I assume Hergé was most likely amused by that. He was certainly far too famous to let it bother him. It certainly added to his disenchantment with the Catholics in his later years. So anyway, the only vantage point that would even suggest some romantic or even erotic shenanigans going on in Marlinspike take place in this book here. And of course, it is all just rubbish propagated by Rainbow Press, suggesting that Captain Haddock has a relationship with an affair with Bianca Castafiore. This entire story is about a stolen gem and about prejudice. Next to Blue Lotus, it is probably the one volume that deals with chauvinism and prejudice in the most direct way, leaving no question where Hergé stood when it came to assigning guilt to entire cultures and stuff like that. Of course, critics remarked that Hergé is still talking about himself the entire time and how the press butchered him after World War II, calling him a traitor and a fascist, brainwashing their children on a weekly basis. So yeah, one could make the argument that this volume is also a bit of a reckoning with media and press, with whom Hergé had a very problematic relationship with. But I think this story is much more about mass media and the rise of the paparazzi culture, which was a new thing at the beginning of 1963. And I would point out that the reason why Hergé was actually able to make such a light-hearted comedy about it all had more to do with the fact that the press had finally given up on bashing him in the 60s. So Hergé could observe other witch hunts in the press without being the object of the mockery himself. And this was mostly about unimportant issues like Sophia Loren being robbed of her jewelry in her hotel and things like that. And Hergé was also fascinated with the paparazzi's obsession with Maria Callas. That also meant that he would spice Bianca Castafiore up a bit. Before that, she was this rather annoying diva, far past her own zenith. But now Hergé made her more stylish, more sexual, significantly more dominant. So it made sense that the Rainbow Press would come up with affairs and scandals that they could pin on Madame Castafiore. Overall, this story is what one would call a farce. It could be recreated on stage as a funny theater play and probably had been done before. Again, many people don't like this volume that much, and it certainly was a little less successful with young people back in the day for all the obvious reasons. First, there is no exotica. It is all one building plus the park outside. Even Captain Haddock spends almost the entire volume in a wheelchair, which is hilarious. And there is usually the assumption that Towntown must always be exotic and travel to distant places, or at least be entangled in some plot by the organized crime. And in this story, there isn't even a proper villain. It is just about two things, the human nature and mass media, which makes this volume incredibly modern for 1963. Hence, I regard this as one of Hergé's finest hours, and actually a very underrated gem. Number 4 is the 1954's Explorers on the Moon, On a marché sur la Lune. Probably the most difficult volume to accomplish, and the second part of a 2-part adventure doing the unspeakable, bringing the Towntown family into space. Towntown, Snowy, Haddock, Professor Calculus, and by accident even the 2 clueless detectives Thompson and Thompson. It is a beautiful adventure, and by far the one comic in the Tintin collection that had the most difficult and expensive pre-production phase. Hergé was even consulting space travel pioneers and visionaries on the technical details. Hergé was also a good friend with Bernard Heuvelman, who was more of a fringe scientist, honestly, by today's standards, but very well read, so Hergé employed him as an advisor. But he also consulted with Alexandre Ananoff and probably Auguste Piccard. Anyway, the biggest influence on this volume were the astronomical paintings by the American illustrator Chesley Bonestell. So in 1954, 15 years before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, Tintin, Haddock and Calculus, and of course Snowy, are the first people standing on the moon. It is a wonderful, careless adventure in space combined with a spy story. And this attention to detail paid off, because once you think about it, the idea is goofy as hell. What do you mean, Towntown in space? Why would you do that? But if you are smart about it, then the unlikely becomes plausible, and that is what you want to achieve with such a wild premise. This whole volume is an incredible achievement and pretty much a huge case of teamwork, with everybody working on it who at that time was employed at the studios Hergé. Josette Beaujour, she was the colorist here, contributing to this magical landscape on the moon, while most of the background and space was probably created by Bob Demore. This is a visually stunning comic and a wonderful, wonderful conclusion to this adventurous double feature. Number 3 is the 1952's Destination Moon, Objectif Lune. So this is the first part of the Moon Double adventure. And it may feel a little counterintuitive that I'm ranking it a little higher than the space adventure itself, because this first part is all about preparation and about a spy plot. So this entire story takes place at the Sprogje Atomic Research Center in Sildavia, where Professor Calculus runs a new space program with the objective to build a spaceship that could bring people on the moon. And I find the atmosphere in this research center so fascinating. And it is the quality of this volume that makes it possible that you swallow the next one, where they actually go to space so easily, because of this wonderful attention to detail, but also because of the mood and the atmosphere, which creates the plausibility for such an absurd high concept like Tintin in space. There is certainly a fascinating sense of isolation in this story, where our heroes are deep inside the mountains of Sildavia, working in this secret facility built into mountains. This is also the only time we experience our protagonists out of their usual iconic clothing, since everybody is wearing those nifty boiler suits. Now, for some, the pacing of this album might be considered a little slow. There are actually a lot of meetings and briefings being shown, but Hergé uses those somewhat boring moments to infuse some truly anarchic humor into the story. So for me, this is like one of the most atmospheric volumes of the entire Tintin oeuvre, and of course it has the most dramatic cliffhanger that could actually be achieved in this type of story. But to imagine that people had to wait for weeks or months to actually read the continuation in the Tintin magazine, well. Number 2 is the 1956 The Calculus Affair, L'Affaire Tournesol. Now, the Calculus affair was the first adventure right after the Moon double feature, and Hergé acknowledges that in the story itself. Professor Calculus is rather famous now, but he also has a change of heart. There is a lot of Oppenheimer in this story, and Hergé certainly continues this sense of paranoia that was already present during the two Moon volumes. But that reflected the zeitgeist a lot, since the world was becoming imbued in what people would start to call the Cold War. And it is the Cold War spirit that drives this story. But at the same time, this is one of the most energetic, if not the most energetic story in the Towntown world. It is a dynamic chase across Europe, mostly in cars, on the trail of secret agents who had hijacked Professor Calculus to force him to give them secrets to his latest invention that could function as a horrible weapon. So this entire story is still a little tied together with the Moon adventures, so in a weird way they make a kind of a trilogy. And the car chases and the entire sense of urgency hovering over this story is truly marvelous. Very interesting is the portrayal of Borduria and Sildavia. Back in the day when Hergé made King Ottokar's scepter, the roles were simple. The Bordurians were the fascists, and the Sildavians were the noble people in love with their aristocratic leaders. But Hergé had shed many ideological skins since 1938, and his portrayal of Borduria and Sildavia is not as black and white. It actually kind of feels like black and black. Or to be more precise, it is all much more of a grey zone. Because the Sildavians are not the good guys here. They are just another competitor in the intelligence community. So at this point, Hergé certainly became more cynical and less idealistic and wanted to reflect the geopolitical realities of those times. But of course, what makes this story so great is the energy and the tearing pace. And now we have reached my all-time number one from the world of Tintin. I'm talking about the 1944's Red Rackham's Treasure, Le Trésor de Rackham le Rouge. My number one in this ranking is the second half of the double feature that started with The Secret of the Unicorn. This is where we meet Professor Calculus for the first time, and where Tintin and Haddock set out to find an island with a treasure. This story is not even particularly fast-paced, and it is almost lazy in some parts, considering the atmosphere. It is about organizing an expedition, about crossing the Atlantic, diving and digging, about exploring a tropical island, but it is all done in the most charming, escapistic atmosphere. This volume supposedly contains Hergé's own favorite panel of all his work, and it is this one. So this is the perfect comic book to take your mind off things. It is more about the mood than about the story, that is true. And it certainly represents Hergé's own mind, since this was created in the middle of the occupation, and probably shows his effort to shut out the world outside and bury himself into work. I just find this book really magical, even though not that much happens in the story. So I kind of understand why Spielberg and Jackson dropped this entire plot from their movie during the making of The Secret of the Unicorn movie. But they of course replaced it with typical chest-puffing Hollywood cliches, which probably angered me a little at the beginning, but now, years later, I'm kind of glad they did not pick up this volume. I'm glad for all the selfish reasons. So anyway, this is my all-time favorite Tintin book, and this was my ranking and grading of all the 25 Tintin stories. I hope you have enjoyed this at least a little. I do have a bit of a Tintin trigger in my head, so if you say, Hergé, Tintin, go, I can probably blather for hours without stopping, but I try to be coherent. Anyway, have a nice day. See you. Bye bye.